Ever stop to think about what actually holds together the entire system of buying and selling homes in England and Wales? Well, it's a revolutionary law, nearly 100 years old, that took centuries of legal tangles and created the modern system we use every single day.
So, that's what we're diving into. We're going to explore the story of the Law of Property Act 1925. And the big question is, how did this one single piece of legislation manage to bring order to what was, honestly, a complete and utter legal jungle?
Because before 1925, if you were trying to buy a piece of land, you'd run into concepts like this.
And weirdly specific things like this.
And even this. Now, these weren't just dusty old history terms. This was the live, confusing, and incredibly risky system people had to deal with. It turned even the simplest purchase into a massive gamble.
Okay, so here's how we're going to break it all down. First, we'll look at just how puzzling that old system was. Then, we'll see how the Act pulled off a great simplification. We'll also cover how it started protecting buyers, how it brought mortgages into the modern era, and finally, why this century-old law is still so important today.
You have to understand, before this act, owning land was just ridiculously complicated. We're talking about a whole mess of overlapping ancient ways to own something, a lot of which went all the way back to feudal times. It meant that buying property was just fraught with risk, because who really owned what was often a complete mystery.
And this was the huge problem that Parliament decided to fix. The official goal, right there in the preamble, was to consolidate. That's really just a formal way of saying they wanted to take a giant pile of messy, conflicting laws and forge them into one single, modern, and understandable rulebook. So how in the world did they solve this massive puzzle? Well, it came down to its single biggest achievement: a radical, game-changing simplification of property ownership itself. This slide right here, this is the core genius of the whole thing. On the left, you see the chaos of the old system. The Act just swept all of that away. And on the right, you see the solution. It boiled everything down to just two main ways to legally own property, what the law calls legal estates. Everything else, all those other complex rights, were neatly tucked away as equitable interests, making the whole system so much clearer. And it did this with some really smart moves. For example, if land was owned by more than one person, it was automatically put into a trust to make it easier to sell. It created clear rules for things like party walls between houses, and it also protected kids by saying they couldn't own land directly. Instead, adult trustees had to manage it for them.
But look, this wasn't just about tidying things up for the sake of it. The real point was to protect the ordinary person trying to buy property. It was all about making the process safer, clearer, and way more predictable for everyone.
And you can see here how the Act basically created a standardized, secure roadmap for buying a home. It clarified the rules for contracts, it stopped buyers from having to investigate a property's history all the way back to the Middle Ages, and it even laid out what happens if, say, the house burns down between signing the contract and getting the keys. It built a secure process from start to finish. And the Act went even further, giving buyers real, concrete rights. For instance, Section 48 made it illegal for a seller to force you to use their lawyer, which used to be a common, unfair trick. And Section 49 gave both sides a simple way to ask a court to settle a dispute without having to launch a huge, expensive lawsuit. It was a game changer. All right, let's talk about mortgages. For most of us, a mortgage is the only way we can buy a home. And you guessed it, the 1925 Act brought some much-needed clarity here too. So first, a couple of quick but really important definitions. The Act uses specific terms. The lender, say the bank, is the mortgagee. And the borrower, the person buying the house, is the mortgagor. Getting these legal roles straight was the first step in creating a standard, predictable relationship. Then, the Act clearly spells out a lender's powers. Section 101 gives them the right to insure the property. And crucially, it formalizes their power to sell the property if the borrower stops paying. Section 109 also gives them the power to bring someone in to manage the property. This wasn't about being unfair, it was about creating a clear, predictable set of rules for what happens when things go wrong.
Now, what's so incredible about all this is that we're not just talking about some dusty old historical document. This is a living, breathing piece of legislation that has been constantly updated to keep up with the times. And this timeline just shows you a few examples of that. Back in 1959, it was amended to better handle issues around mental health. In 1989, a whole new law came in to update its rules on contracts. And just look, as recently as 2024, brand new sections are added to deal with modern problems like rent charges. It's a huge testament to how strong that original framework is, that it can be adapted and built upon, not just thrown out.
Its legacy is just immense. The ideas and definitions from the 1925 Act are basically the fundamental grammar of property law in England and Wales. It's the foundation that hundreds of other laws are built on, shaping everything from housing policy to environmental rules.
And that leaves us with a really fascinating final thought. The 1925 Act was designed for a world of physical dirt and paper deeds. But today, our idea of property is expanding to include digital assets, and transactions are happening with smart contracts. So the big question is, how long can this 20th century masterpiece continue to be the foundation for our 21st century world?